Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Books and Books in Coral Gables. Thank you all for coming down tonight. We're live streaming the event this evening for the folks of you watching at home. If you would like to purchase a copy of Breaking the Line and have Professor Freedman sign it for you, just call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you, and we'll mail it to you free wherever you are in the United States. This evening, Books and Books is very pleased to present Professor Samuel G. Freedman and his new book, Breaking the Line, the season in black college football that transformed the sport and changed the course of civil rights. Professor Freedman is an award-winning author, journalist, and educator, a columnist for the New York Times, and a professor at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He is the author of 6 acclaimed books, 4 of which have been New York Times Notable Books of the Year. In this book, Professor Freedman takes us to September 1967, with the football season beginning at Louisiana's Grambling College and at Florida A&M. The teams were led by 2 extraordinary coaches, Eddie Robinson and Jake Gaither, and they featured the best quarterbacks ever at each school, James Harris and Ken Riley. Together, they helped compel the segregated colleges of the South to integrate their teams and redefined who could play quarterback in the NFL, who could be a head coach, and who could run a franchise as a general manager. He captures a pivotal time in American sport and society, filling a missing and crucial chapter in the movement for civil rights. This book has been getting some excellent reviews. One of them, I have a quote here from the historian David Marinas. He says, "When history writes people out, it is our job to write them back in. Samuel G. Freedman has done a marvelous job of that in Breaking the Line, his illuminating account of football and race in the South." Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Professor Samuel G. Freedman.
Thank you very much, Victor, and welcome to the live streaming audience. And my thanks, as always, to Books and Books, a remarkable store run by the remarkable Mitchell Kaplan, and a great friend to authors like me. I think this is the 3rd, if not the 4th, of my books that I've been here for. And I also have to say that among the members of the audience here tonight are 2 players, at least 2, who are on the Florida A&M team that I write about in the book, Otis Collier and Herman Jackson. There may be others as well. And so it's especially enjoyable, especially meaningful to be here in Miami, which, as we'll hear, is one of the places where the events in this book reach their crescendo. But right now, just in the last few weeks, we've been marking the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and of the I Have a Dream speech. And those events, those commemorations, are part of a series of 50th anniversary events. No, we're having technical difficulties here. No, I'm doing page. Okay. March on Washington, and it's not working. Okay. Okay. We're going to start all over. We're marking the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, of the I Have a Dream speech, and that's part of a pattern of anniversaries from the summer of 1963. Some of them idealistic, some of them very tragic. The killing of Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King writing the letter from Birmingham jail, the bombing of the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, and John F. Kennedy's speech endorsing what would later become the Civil Rights Act of 1963. As football fans, right now, we're also watching the new season start, with a lot of eyes on 2 black quarterbacks, Robert Griffin III, RG3 of the Washington Redskins, and Russell Wilson of the Seattle Seahawks. The defending Super Bowl champs, the Baltimore Ravens, have an African-American general manager, Ozzie Newsome, who's won 2 Super Bowl rings there, as has another African-American GM, Jerry Reese of the Giants. In college, the defending BCS champions, Alabama, field a team with a large number of black players and some black coaches as well. You might ask what one has to do with another, what civil rights then has to do with pro and college football now. But as a historian, I always believe that the past is prologue. And I believe that what happened in the 1967 season of black college football shaped the game as we know it now and improved America as a society. Segregation covered every aspect of life in the South. It mandated separate water fountains, separate waiting rooms, separate public facilities, separate hotels, separate buses. And football in the South was very much part of the pattern of segregation. Martin Luther King famously said that Sunday morning was the most segregated time in America. He was referring to the segregation of church, but he just as well could have said Saturday afternoon, because segregation ruled college football for these years as well. The football teams at the big state universities in the South, Alabama, Ole Miss, LSU, Georgia, they remained all white for as much as a decade after the schools themselves had been compelled by federal troops and federal law to at least admit a handful of black students. The Alabama fight song had a line about being the pride of Dixie. Now you might say that that was meant to be regional pride, or you might say, as I tend to, that it was a dog whistle, a coded way of speaking to a sense of white supremacy. And indeed, the desire of these state schools to keep their teams all white was a way of proving, in a part of the country where football meant so much, where it was so much more than a game, that white coaches were superior to black coaches, that white players were superior to black players, and that if a team like Alabama could go and win a national championship without any black players on it, and as late as 1969, if you had the so-called game of the century between Texas and Arkansas, ranked 1 and 2, both of them entirely white, then you were making an argument through sport for white superiority. But all along, there was a parallel universe of black colleges. Some of these black colleges were in the North and in the border states. Most of them were in the South. Some of them had been founded by religious denominations that had a truly genuine desire to help black Americans in improving their lot in life and in gaining the higher education that was otherwise denied to them. But most of these schools were founded by state legislators and governors in the South with one goal in mind, which was to use them as a rationale for not desegregating the major state universities. These schools were meant to be the proof that, quote, separate was equal, that canard that came from the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court ruling. They weren't in any way meant to be equal. They were given less money, poorer facilities. Just to cite one example, at Grambling College, one of the schools I write about, there had been, during World War II, a prison camp for German POWs nearby. After the war ended and the prisoners were repatriated, their barracks was sent to Grambling College for use as faculty housing. But an amazing thing happened at the black colleges. And just like what we know about soul food, is that the parts of animals and the crops that were considered the most disposable, the least attractive, were turned by the brilliance of black cooks into a fine cuisine. The same thing happened with the HBCUs, the historically black colleges and universities. Through the efforts and the desires and the will of their students, their administrators, their faculty members, their staff, these schools, intended to be inferior, became instead the centers of black advancement, black excellence, black aspiration, black talent, black self-determination. Some of the most famous African Americans of the 20th century came out of these schools: Thurgood Marshall, Ralph Ellison, Benjamin Mays. And in the civil rights era, thousands of foot soldiers and many leaders came out of the HBCUs, out of places like Fisk and North Carolina A&T and Florida A&M. People like John Lewis, Diane Nash, Jesse Jackson. And And football was part of the culture of black excellence at these schools. Arguably the most excellent of all were Grambling in northern Louisiana and Florida A&M in Tallahassee. And their head coaches were the illustrious Jake Gaither at Florida A&M and Eddie Robinson at Grambling. Now, for anyone who's seen the recent movie The Butler, I think you get an insight into the life and the struggles and the peculiar situation of Eddie Robinson and Jake Gaither. We know from that film, if you've seen it or if you've read about it, that Forrest Whitaker's character, based on a real man who was a butler in the White House, grew up in the worst of the Jim Crow years, and it saw at a close remove the most unspeakable kind of violence. We know that he held out within. It's not anything he ever told about his children, as if he could spare them the pain of the world by not saying it. We know that he had to figure out a way to accommodate a world in which white people held all the meaningful power. And we know from that film that his own son, who becomes an activist in the civil rights movement, looks at him critically, harshly even, wondering why he hasn't been out there on the barricades. And when I saw that movie, it reminded me so much of Jake Gaither and Eddie Robinson, both of them born in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, both of them having experienced, again, just like Forrest Whitaker's character, at a very close remove, the most hideous kind of violence. In fact, Jake Gaither drove down to Tallahassee in 1937 to take his first job there about 2 weeks after a double lynching had occurred. And as awful as the lynching was, what I thought was even more awful in a certain way was reading the newspaper coverage of it there, an editorial in the Tallahassee paper that extolled it as being an orderly kind of lynching, the right kind of lynching, as if there would be any wrong, as if there were right and wrong kinds of lynchings. And Jake Gaither didn't tell that story to people. He held that within for decades. Towards the end of his life, he gave an oral history, and he talked in that oral history about driving down with his wife Sadie and stopping to get a Coca-Cola on the outskirts of Tallahassee. And when he went into the gas station, and there were a group of rednecks hanging around the counter, wondering what might happen, and wondering if he had made a mistake taking a job in Tallahassee because of that lynching. Eddie Robinson, meanwhile, went up to Grambling in the early 1940s, and he went there in the wake of a lynching in Ruston, Louisiana, the town right near Grambling, that was celebrated like a local holiday. Hundreds of people gathering to celebrate the fact that a young black man, dubiously accused of sexual assault against a white woman, had been hauled by a mob out of his home, tortured, lynched, shot, and it was all celebrated by the white folks in Ruston. So they knew the terrible price that black people who stood out in any way were liable to pay. And they couldn't see a world in the 1920s and 30s and 40s that ever looked like it was going to change. And they also went to work as coaches and educators at colleges that were controlled by the white legislatures and regents and governors of Louisiana and Florida. And they knew that if they stood up, if they took a risk, they could be fired, their players could be expelled from school, the schools could have their budgets cut, and all kinds of punishment could be meted out, and they would have no way of resisting it. And yet, at the same time, both of these men saw a way to make a contribution to the movement. They did it in subtle ways. For instance, their own lives were meant to be role models for their players and their student athletes. Jake Gaither and his wife Sadie, Eddie Robinson and his wife Doris, these were couples in which both wives were educators. There were marriages that lasted for a half century apiece. Eddie Robinson used to say that his motto in life was one job, one wife. And he made that a point of modeling that to his players. Many of Jake Gaither's players called him and his wife Sadie Mom and Pop. They would come and visit them in their home. They were always welcome there, just as players were welcome to stop in and see Eddie Robinson and Doris Robinson down at Grambling. Both of these men had master's degrees. One of the paradoxes of segregation is that the coaches who wanted to get master's degrees, for that matter, any African American who wanted to get a master's degree, couldn't get it in the South. At that point, none of the black colleges were allowed to have graduate divisions. None of the white universities would accept them. And so segregation in the South, the laws gave money to these black future scholars to go to northern schools, to go to the great research universities in the north to get their master's degrees there. And there was this kind of magical connection, this pipeline between the HBCUs in the South and many of the Big Ten research universities, Ohio State, where Jake Gaither got his master's, Iowa, where Eddie Robinson got his, and even Teachers College at Columbia, NYU, Kansas State. They got superior educations. Jake Gaither's whole staff in 1967, the period when I'm writing about in the book, every one of those men had a master's degree. Jake Gaither also had an annual coaching clinic, and it was one of his subtle ways of challenging segregation. He would invite white and black coaches to come down to Tallahassee during the summer to see him teach about his famous split-line T offense. And the outstanding coaches of the country, Woody Hayes, Frank Howard of Clemson, Bobby Dodd of Georgia Tech, Bear Bryant even of Alabama, coaches in some cases of segregated teams, came to sit on equal footing with black coaches at Jake Gaither's clinics. They would sit together under those willow trees on the FAMU campus. And that was one of Jake Gaither's subtle ways of making social change. But the biggest thing they did, perhaps, was to create generations of educated, dignified, purposeful young black men. They took both parts of the student-athlete equation with the utmost seriousness. When Jake Gaither and Eddie Robinson went out to recruit a player, they didn't say, like some coaches do, you're going to start a quarterback next year, or you're going to be a 4-year starter. What they said to the parents was, your son is going to go to church on Sunday, your son is going to go to class every day, your son is going to get a degree. That athletic scholarship was seen less as a possible ticket to pro football and much more as a ticket to a diploma and to a meaningful life. And the kinds of lives that their players went on to included ministry, music, education, coaching, real estate agent, insurance agent, you name it. One of the players on the 1967 team at Florida A&M, John Eason, later did a doctoral dissertation, and he did his study on the effect of Jake Gaither on his players. And he did a poll, and something like 95% of those players got their bachelor's degrees. Another 2/3 of those players got master's degrees. At least a half dozen got doctorates. And when my wife and I were up at Grambling over the summer for their Sports Hall of Fame induction event, we heard story after story from men now in their 60s and 70s who had gotten their bachelor's degrees at Grambling through athletic scholarships, whose children were now going to MIT or Stanford or Yale or Johns Hopkins. The whole destiny of these families had been changed by the scholarships and the opportunities that Jake Gaither and Eddie Robinson offered. And they would make sure that they kept their word to those parents. Eddie Robinson was known for walking through the dorms, ringing a cowbell to wake up his players. He'd have an assistant coach waiting in the cafeteria to hold the meal cards that the players needed to get their cafeteria meals. You had to show up there in the morning to get your card, or you didn't get to eat all day. And Coach Robinson believed that if you got up and ate breakfast, you were going to go to class. Jake Gaither, very similar. Jake Gaither assigned his assistant coaches to keep track of the class attendance and grades of all the position players they coached. And when someone was slacking in class, Jake Gaither didn't go to the professor and say, come on, cut this kid a break, we need him on Saturday. Jake Gaither told the assistant coach to stay on that player's case, and he brought in the player to say, don't mess up. One of his mottos for his players was, get your lesson. Get your lesson. He'd say, and give me all you got. And I see a couple of the rattlers here are nodding. They remember hearing it. And both of them would send assistant coaches out to the churches in town on Sunday to make sure their players went to church. And that's how they made sure that their promise was kept. That's how they kept their vow that they'd made to those parents. But at the same time, because they hadn't been out there in public on civil rights. They came under criticism. Tallahassee had had a profound and important civil rights movement of its own, had a bus boycott shortly after the Montgomery bus boycott, had lunch counter sit-ins, had picketing against the segregated Florida theater downtown, and I love this detail, which at the time was showing the movie The Ugly American. And through it all, Jake Gaither didn't take a public stand. He had a falling out with his own pastor, Reverend C.K. Steele, who was the leader of the movement in Tallahassee, because he didn't step out there more publicly. Eddie Robinson, very similarly. During the 1967 summer, when civil rights activity was finally making its way up to northern Louisiana, it had been late coming there to that remote area, one of his ex-players came to see him, a guy named Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick, who'd played pro football and then become active in a group called Deacons for Defense and Justice, a group that protected civil rights workers and that tried to intimidate the Klan to keep the Klan from intimidating the civil rights workers. And Kirkpatrick asked Eddie Robinson, would he endorse them? Would he say something publicly? And Eddie Robinson, even though privately he sympathized with the movement, said he couldn't do anything public. And Jake Gaither, for his part, who gave the most erudite and eloquent speeches about black history to black audiences, never gave them to white audiences, never said it to the politicians with whom he was on a first-name basis. And so they knew, these coaches, how they were ridiculed and insulted by their critics. They knew they were called Uncle Toms. They knew that they were called handkerchief heads. They knew they were called Benedict Arnolds. And it hurt them deeply, because they also knew how much they wanted to see the world change. As coaches, they'd experienced the inequalities. They knew that when their team went on a road to play another game, they had to carefully plan the one place where they could stop and get a meal, the one place where their players could use the bathroom. When they got to the opposing school they were playing, there was no motel they could stay at, no motel that would accept them. They would stay on the floor of the gym, or in the basement of a dorm, or some other place on the opposing campus. And they knew that the facilities they had, the budget they had, the field they had was inferior to what you could see at the white colleges almost next door, Louisiana Tech or Florida State. So they'd experienced it all firsthand. And something happened then in 1967. In 1967, both of them came off the sidelines, metaphorically speaking. And for the first time, they began to take a stand overtly through sports on behalf of civil rights. And that's at the core of the story I tell in Breaking the Line. Now, just as a football season, 1967 is an exceptional one. FAMU and Grambling, Jake Gaither and Eddie Robinson were great, fierce rivals and respectful rivals, but they played in different leagues, so almost the only time they ever got to play each other was here in Miami, in the Orange Bowl, in the game called the Orange Blossom Classic, that was essentially the Super Bowl of black college football. So the few times they ever met, and I think it was 4 in total, it was for all the marbles. And in that 1967 season, both of these schools plowed through their opponents, running an 8-1 record, heading for that showdown here in Miami in the Classic. Each of them was led by the best quarterback ever to play at that school up to that point, James Harris at Grambling, Ken Riley at Florida A&M. But behind the scenes, off the Saturday gridiron, even more important things were going on. In Eddie Robinson's case, 1967 was the year when his effort to develop James Harris to break the color barrier at quarterback in the NFL was reaching its crescendo. Jake Gaither was going behind the scenes in Florida, paying visits up to the state capitol and the state office buildings to get approval for his lifelong goal of being able to have the first ever game in the South between a black college team and a white college team, a game that would ultimately take place in 1969. Let's talk about James Harris first. James Harris, on the day in August 1963, when Martin Luther King is giving the I Have a Dream speech, is 16 years old. He's sitting at home in Monroe, Louisiana, watching the speech on TV, partly because two of his high school friends who were already in the movement are up in Washington and he's hoping to see him on the TV. But he's also watching it because he has a pressing question in mind. He's coming out off a sophomore year, entering a junior year. He just won the state championship in Louisiana as a starting quarterback the previous fall. But he's wondering, should I change positions? Should I give up on being a quarterback? He wants to play pro football. And for a young man growing up in Monroe, Louisiana, that's not an idle aspiration. It's not like I want to play football and I want to be an astronaut and I want to be, a millionaire too. He had seen many young men from Monroe go on to the pros. But he also had studied pro sports enough to know that every time a black quarterback got to the pros, that black quarterback would be forced to change positions. There'd always be the official excuse. He's so fast, he's so elusive, let's make him a wide receiver, let's make him a defensive back. But the real reason, the prevailing racist view of the time, was that no black was smart enough to be quarterback. Quarterback, I would argue, is the most cerebral position in any sport. And the belief was that no black had the brain power to do it. And what went with that was also a never openly stated view that we couldn't have a black person giving orders to a white person. But what does a quarterback do other than tell the offense what to do? What's a quarterback other than the coach on the field? So for the racial order to be maintained, no black was going to be allowed to play quarterback. And so James Harris was wondering, as he watched the I Have a Dream speech, maybe I should ask my coach to change me to defensive back right now, because that way at least I'll have a chance to go to the pros. And remember, we know now what that speech was. As everyone was sitting there watching it, no one knew what it was going to be. And as James Harris is watching it and hears Martin Luther King utter that now famous line about the content of our character, that's when he decides, I'm not going to change position. I'm going to stick with playing quarterback. I'm going to take my chances against all the odds. And so he turns down a scholarship offer later to go to Michigan State, where they're going to make him into an end. And he decides to go to Grambling instead. Now, a year after he's watching the I Have a Dream speech, a year and a quarter after, Eddie Robinson is in New York doing Howard Cosell's radio show. And Howard Cosell had been a great supporter of Grambling and of Eddie Robinson, one of the few white journalists to pay any attention to black college football. But Howard Cosell was also a provocateur. So Howard Cosell can't resist asking Eddie Robinson this pointed question, saying basically, okay, you've sent so many players to the pros. Why haven't you sent a black quarterback? Do you think you could do that? Eddie Robinson holds on to his civility, says how he has studied as much football and as many coaches as possible, and yes, he believes he can do it. Inside, though, he's steaming. He goes straight from Howard Cosell's studio to the airport, flies down to Monroe, Louisiana, drives straight from the airport in Monroe to James Harris's family's house. And sitting there with James Harris and his mom, because James Harris's father had passed away by this time, he says, speaking of Cosell, can you believe he asked me if I could make a black quarterback? And then he pauses and says, there's not one now, but in 4 years there's going to be one. And that's his way of saying to James Harris that if you come to Grambling, you're going to be the one. You're going to be the chosen one. Now, what he knows he has in James Harris are a lot of the necessary traits. James Harris is tall and strong. He's got a powerful and accurate arm. He plays in the kind of the classic drop-back quarterback style. He's also the son of a minister and a nurse. He's got an older brother who's a military officer, an older sister who's also a nurse. The most cherished possession in the family house is a 2,000-page dictionary that his father uses to write his sermons. So he's got the brain power to be a quarterback. And James Harris is mature and seasoned for his years. He's seen his father die already. He knows what mortality is all about. And he has that incalculable strength of character that it's going to take to be the Jackie Robinson, to be the first one, to be the one who gets taunted and baited. And so Eddie Robinson gives him that scholarship to come up to Grambling. But that's not all he does. Grambling up to that point won its games by basically running the ball, by dominating teams. They didn't need the quarterback to win the game. They needed the quarterback just not to lose the game. But in order to create a pro quarterback out of James Harris, Eddie Robinson, a real man of habits, changes some of those habits. He brings in a coach named Doug Porter, who's an expert in the passing offense. He recruits future pros at wide receiver, Charlie Joyner, Frank Lewis, a wingback named Essex Johnson, the targets who James Harris will be able to throw downfield to. He gets playbooks when he visits the pro camps over the summer. And when former Grambling players come back to campus during the summer, they always bring some intelligence from their teams to Eddie Robinson. And every time James Harris is sitting in Eddie Robinson's office, Eddie Robinson has a napkin or a placemat or a paper bag with some plays diagrammed on it, because that's all part of, as James Harris would later put it, customizing my game, getting ready to play in the pros. And there's one other part of it. Part of the football program at Grambling is an SID, a sports information director named Collie J. Nicholson. And he is the one who takes on the responsibility of playing the skeptical, in-your-face journalist, the kind James Harris is going to run into in the pros. And he's the one who literally sticks a microphone in James Harris's face and sticks a camera in his face and throws the kind of hostile, challenging questions at him that he's going to get when he breaks that barrier in the pros. Why do you think you deserve it? How did you feel about being booed today? All of those sorts of questions. And it's all about preparing James Harris to break that barrier. And it all culminates in a particular game in October of 1967. Grambling against Tennessee State. Tennessee State, coached by John Merritt, one of the most successful and some would say roguish coaches in black college football, led by Eldridge Dickey, the quarterback who's a senior now, who's considered the most likely quarterback to go to the NFL, to break the color barrier. And in that game, in front of a packed house in Nashville, Tennessee, in a stadium so hostile it was called The Hole, James Harris outduels Eldridge Dickey. He throws for more yardage. He throws for more touchdowns. He wins the game. And that's the game that begins to announce to the pro scouts that James Harris has the mettle, as well as the talent, to be that barrier-breaking quarterback in the NFL. But now I want to come back over to Tallahassee and Jake Gaither and FAMU. Over all his years in Tallahassee, Jake Gaither, sometimes to the confoundment of the activists on the campus and in Tallahassee, had kept up cordial relations with a series of segregationist governors in Florida. He set aside segregated seats for white legislators to go to FAMU's home games. He wrote congratulatory letters to governors who were going to keep segregation in place. He had to figure out ways to finesse and manage the white man, especially when the white man happened to be the governor. Claude Kirk was the governor during the 1967 season. Jake Gaither would always have a party. He and Sadie would throw a party at their home after every home game. Claude Kirk would have a state trooper drive him up there, and when there weren't parking spaces along the curb, he'd have the state trooper would park his car in Jake Gaither's front lawn, a sign of the most profound disrespect. One day Claude Kirk comes over to practice at FAMU, and he wants to sort of pretend to be the coach himself. And so he sees a player make a mistake, and he curses at him. Now, one of Jake Gaither's rules, and it was also one of Eddie Robinson's, was never to curse at a player. They treated their players with dignity. They never demeaned them that way. And so Jake Gaither hears this and has to figure out what to do. How can I upbraid the governor and get away with it? But how can I let the governor insult profanely one of my players? So he thinks on his feet, and he points to one of his assistant coaches, Robert Mungin, and says, "Mungin, why do you curse at that guy?" Mungin looks back baffled. He knew he hadn't cursed, but Gaither had reprimanded him loudly enough so that he knew Claude Kirk would hear it. And Claude Kirk didn't curse anyone else out the rest of that practice. But that kind of effort to subtly deal with white power, to try to accommodate oneself to white power, was all in the service, and Gaither's critics never knew this, of a much larger goal. All along, Jake Gaither was making deposits in what I like to call the favor bank. All along, he was building up his political leverage. All along, he was building up his goodwill up on Capitol Hill in Tallahassee. And in the fall of 1967, he went to the window of the favor bank and asked for his money and went to cash it in. And what he cashed it in to do was to ask the Board of Regents to allow all-black Florida A&M, the Rattlers, to play any white college team that would be willing to play them. Now, the Board of Regents pretty much realized they had to grant Jake Gaither this one wish. It was the one thing he had asked for over all the years. He had a lot of chits in the favor bank, but they were fearful of it. They were fearful on several levels. What would happen if a black coach outcoached a white coach? What would happen if a black team beat a white team? What would that say about white supremacy? And would it cause riots? What would happen if FAMU beat, the Florida Gators or beat the Florida State Seminoles? Would there be rioting in the street? They really had these questions. And so what they ultimately did was give him a verbal approval to play that game, but never put it in writing. The Regents didn't want their fingerprints on that game in case anything went badly. And it took 2 years for Jake Gaither to get someone to take up the offer. And that person who takes it up is a coach who comes out of Miami here, Fran Kersey. He played quarterback for the Miami Hurricanes here, and he'd gone on to become an assistant coach, and then he was getting the head coaching job at the University of Tampa. Now, Fran Kersey was an Italian Catholic from Pittsburgh who had always felt at odds with the racial codes of the South. And he took the job at Tampa, which had an all-white team up to that point, only on the promise from the president of the university that he'd be able to integrate the team. And so he had both idealistic reasons and some very practical ones for taking Jake Gaither's offer, for agreeing to play that first white-black game, which was going to happen in 1969. And in that game, 45,000 people are in Tampa Stadium, packed out. Half of them black fans of FAMU, half of them white fans of Tampa. The game couldn't be closer. It goes down literally to the last play. And if I'm not mistaken, one of our guests here tonight, Otis Collier, was a very significant part of that last play in that game, in the defensive backfield of the Rattlers. And they win the game 34-28 over a very, very accomplished Tampa team. And Fran Kersey is enough of a sportsman and a gentleman to say to the media, I got outcoached tonight. So there, with the ultimate acid test of a game played for everyone to see, Jake Gaither and Florida A&M showed their capacity, showed their ability, showed that they could compete equally and, in fact, better a very good team from a white college. But the most important part of that game is up in the stands, where those 45,000 people are hanging on every play, where the emotional intensity is as thick as the summer air down here in Miami. And nothing goes wrong. There's no fighting. There's no upset. There's no rioting. It ends up being a study in civility. And along the way, and think about this, those 45,000 racially mixed fans at Tampa Stadium are engaging in the largest act of racial integration ever to happen in the South up to that point. This football game is the largest integration of a public facility in the history of the South. This is football, as Jake Gaither had wished, making deep and meaningful social change. And there's an interesting guest there up in the press box that night. It's Eddie Robinson from Grambling. Jake Gaither had invited Eddie Robinson to watch that game because he knew, as I said before, that though there were fierce rivals on the field, they were allies off the field. And even though they knew in some way that once college football became desegregated in the South, they weren't going to be able to recruit as many of the great black players as they had when there was no way for them to go to the Ole Misses or the Alabamas or the LSUs. They're even willing to do something that would diminish their own programs in order to improve the country and to improve the racial climate in their region. And so in the aftermath of this 1969 game, you can just see the acceleration in the recruiting of black players by previously all-white colleges. you can see the beginning, first in the north, then seeping back down to the south, the hiring of black coaches who had been denied jobs in all parts of the country, not just the south before then. And the idea of having an integrated game in the Deep South stops being something that's feared and starts becoming the new normal. And a lot of football fans think that the game that changed so much of this was the 1970 game between Alabama and USC, when an all-white Alabama team got crushed by an integrated USC team. That was an important game, but that was a year after the fact. The game that's the landmark, the game that's the pivot point in history, is this game between Florida A&M and Tampa. And now let's go back and pick up the thread of James Harris's story. So James Harris ends up playing against FAMU in the Orange Blossom Classic, end of the 1967 season. The game goes down to the last play. I'm not going to divulge any spoilers here. You'll have to read Breaking the Line to find out how it ends. But I'll just tell you that there's an MVP chosen from each school, and James Harris is Grambling's MVP that night. He comes back the next year for his senior year, ends up in a big televised game against Morgan State from Yankee Stadium in New York, leads Grambling to its third consecutive conference title. He's chosen the College Player of the Year by the Washington Pigskin Club. But a funny thing happens at the end of the season. He's not invited to the Senior Bowl or the Hula Bowl or the Blue-Gray game or the East-West game, all of these all-star games that serve in effect as auditions for the pro scouts. And when it comes to the draft, which at that time took place over 2 days, he sits for the whole first day through the first 5-6 rounds, waiting to be chosen, and he's not chosen. Not until the second day, in the 8th round, does he finally get picked by the Buffalo Bills. And it was no accident that he got snubbed by the All-Star games, and it was no accident that he didn't get picked till the 8th round, because he and Eddie Robinson had given out the same message to the pros. James Harris is not going to change positions. Now, there's an interesting detail about James Harris. His nickname is Shaq, and it comes from Meshach in the Bible. And as some of us know from the book of Daniel, Meshach is one of those 3 Jews who refused to bow down to an alien god, who said to the Babylonian king, you can throw us in your fiery furnace, but we're not going to bow down to an alien god. And when it came time for the pro draft, he was saying, I'm not going to bow down to the alien god of white supremacy, the alien god of no black is smart enough to play quarterback, the alien god of no black should be able to give orders to white people, even as the field general quarterback. And so he paid the price for that with his late draft choice. When you draft someone in the 8th round, it costs very little to sign them, and you lose very little money if you cut them. The Buffalo Bills put him up in the YMCA. They gave him a part-time job cleaning other players' cleats. Every night, worried, skeptical, James Harris would wait in line for the payphone in the dormitory hall to call Eddie Robinson down in Grambling to get moral support. And Eddie Robinson would give him kind of 2 messages that sound almost irreconcilable. He would tell him, I know you're good enough. And he would also say, if you don't make it, don't come back here and tell me it was because you were black. How is someone supposed to hold those 2 messages together and make sense of them? Well, I think the way James Harris did was like many black people of his generation and of earlier generations. He'd been told all of his life, you're going to have to be twice as good to get an equal chance. And that's what Eddie Robinson was really telling him. You're going to have to be twice as good. And so he was twice as good. And when the 1969 pro season started, on opening day, he was a starting quarterback for the Buffalo Bills. It was the first of many firsts in his career. Now, I can't tell you that the path was smooth. He was injured during his years with Buffalo on and off. They waived him after his 3rd year. He was briefly out of football altogether, but Eddie Robinson helped him get a tryout with the LA Rams, and he stuck. And during 3 years in the mid-1970s, he rewrote football and racial history in this country. In those 3 years, he led the conference in passing twice. He led the Rams to the conference title game twice. He went to the Pro Bowl. He was chosen the Pro Bowl MVP, and he was elected captain by his teammates. But again, Martin Luther King told us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it does bend for justice, and that arc was very long for James Harris. The LA Rams, after those 3 stellar seasons, instead of giving him job security like most quarterbacks would have had, they bring in 4 white quarterbacks to try to take his job. They bring in Joe Namath and Pat Hayden and Vince Ferragamo and Ron Jaworski. And when none of them succeed in beating him out, the Rams just trade him away. They get rid of their quote-unquote problem by sending him to San Diego to be a backup. But an interesting thing happens in 1977 as he's traded, and early 1978. Another quarterback is coming out of Grambling named Doug Williams. Doug Williams had gone to Grambling because when Williams was growing up in Zachary, Louisiana, he was following what James Harris did at Grambling. And he's being drafted in 1978 in the first round by the Tampa Bay Bucks. And when he's in their training camp, the person he calls every night for moral support is James Harris. And he sticks with the Bucks, and ultimately, later with the Washington Redskins, he becomes the first African-American quarterback to win a Super Bowl in the 1988 Super Bowl. And one thing you have to know is that every black quarterback, from Doug Williams to Warren Moon, Donovan McNabb, Steve McNair, all the way up through RG3 and Russell Wilson and E.J. Manuel right now, every one of them went through the door that James Harris blasted open. And last night I got a very interesting question. If James Harris hadn't done it, how long would it have taken? And I'm inclined to say it wouldn't have happened until Doug Williams. It would have been 10 years later if it hadn't happened with James Harris. Now we know in all kinds of ways that the struggle isn't over. We've had a Supreme Court in this country that's told us that we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore. We've seen the verdict in the Trayvon Martin case. I just noticed in the news today that there are protests at the University of Alabama against the segregation of fraternities and sororities. And yet, we can't lose sight of what has been accomplished, both in sports and through sports. The last 7 Super Bowls in the NFL, every one of them has had either an African-American coach or an African-American general manager. At any given time these last few years in the NFL, there are somewhere between 5 and 7 black coaches out of 32 teams. The NFL has had one of the most successful examples of affirmative action in what's called the Rooney Rule, which says that when you have a coaching vacancy, you have to consider an African-American candidate for it. You can't say there aren't any qualified ones out there. And lo and behold, people find out there are qualified candidates, and they win. And at the same time, though, in the colleges, there's still work to be done. There's still an unfinished agenda. There aren't too many more black head coaches in college football, in the top tier teams, those 200 teams, than there are in the 32 teams in the NFL. There's still the power of alumni, the power of boosters, the power of traditions that should have gone out of style a long time ago that's kept those changes from being made. And that's where the change still needs to happen. But I like to think that what progress has been made, and football is so important in America, sports is so important, that if you could integrate the coaching ranks, if you could integrate the quarterbacking ranks, it was going to give a broader message to society that, well, I don't want to try to hang President Obama's election on what happened in football. I'm also inclined to remember what the famous Chicago journalist Mike Royko said after Harold Washington was elected mayor of Chicago, the first black mayor ever in a city that was notable for its deep, rigid segregation and its history of race hate. And everyone thought it was going to be the end of the city when they had a black mayor. And Mike Royko wrote the morning after Harold Washington was elected that Chicago had a black mayor and the Chicago River was still flowing in the same direction. And the fact that things go on in many ways as they went on before is the greatest testament to the kind of change that can be made by those pioneers. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention. I apologize for some of our technological glitches, or as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad used to call it, tricknology. So still trying to master the tricknology, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Freedman. Folks, remember, if you have a question, to raise your hand and let me get to you with the microphone before you place it to Professor Freedman. Anyone wants to go first? Come on now. All right, sir.
Right, it's like church. Is there one? Is there one?
Where do you teach?
I teach at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism.
Journalism, okay.
How far do you go back in Coach Gaither's history?
How far do I go back in Coach Gaither's history? Really, to his upbringing. He had quite a remarkable life. His father was a minister who worked a series of pulpits basically along the Appalachian Ridge, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia. And inspired by his father, Jake Gaither grew up wanting to be a lawyer. And in fact, one of his heroes was Clarence Darrow, because when Jake Gaither was a young man, the Scopes trial was going on in Dayton, Tennessee, where his father was a preacher at that time. And Jake Gaither would go up to the segregated balcony of the courthouse to watch Clarence Darrow defend John Scopes in that case. And if Jake Gaither's father hadn't passed away when Jake Gaither was still in college, I have no doubt he would have ended up being a lawyer, since that was his aspiration. He was a champion debater in college, but then he became basically the head of the household. He needed to go right to work, and he became a teacher and through that a coach as a way of being able to have a reliable way of supporting his family immediately. And, in a way it gets to a broader point, which is that the talent that was on these coaching staffs, the intelligence that was on it, was remarkable, because so many other careers were closed off to Black Americans at that time. And Jake Gaither, I've no doubt, could have been a world-class lawyer, an executive. Eddie Robinson could have been, a professor, could have, run, some kind of an NGO, could have been a prominent minister, all sorts of things. They were overeducated for what they did. That's part of why they were such great coaches. They were smarter than many of the other coaches, particularly the coaches at the white schools who didn't have to overachieve to achieve what they had.
Do you want to slide in what James Harris is doing now?
James Harris is now an executive on the Detroit Lions. He has had a real successful post-playing career as an executive for the Ravens, for the Jets, for the Jaguars here in Florida, and now for the Lions, and was a big part of bringing them back from being an 0-16 team a couple years ago to making the playoffs 2 years ago.
You can speak about your research. It seems like a lot of the information was like public record or from newspaper articles, but was everyone eager to speak to you? Was there any information you really had to fight for or really, really search for?
Well, the hardest thing for me was actually finding the game films. One of the things that characterized the world of Black college football at this time is that the white media ignored it, and that even papers that were in the same town or close by, Florida A&M and Grambling, either wouldn't cover the game or they'd get the most basic details wrong. I'd find a game story in which Florida A&M played Southern, and the box score would say they played Texas Southern. I'd look at that Grambling Tennessee State game I mentioned in my talk, and they'd have the wrong player catching the winning touchdown pass. They'd never make mistakes like that if it was a Tennessee game. They'd never make mistakes like that if it was a Florida State game. And the black newspapers had terrific journalists, sports journalists, people like Rick Roberts and Marion Jackson and Bill Nunn, but they had, a couple of sports writers on a paper trying to cover 50 games in a weekend for a 2 or 3 page sports section. So at best they could cover, a couple of the games that happened. And so to really be able to put together the world of football in the detail I wanted to make it as dramatic as it was on the field, I spent years finding the game films from both colleges and getting them digitized and copied. So then if you saw me out on my research, I was always walking around with these DVDs with me to sit down in people's kitchens and dens and show them the same plays over and over again. Ask, so what are you doing here? Why was that the call? What's happening here that I, as, a fan but not an expert, don't understand? In terms of the accessibility, I mean, Jake Gaither had passed away, long before I started my research. Eddie Robinson was deep in the grips of Alzheimer's at the time I started and died soon after. So I was never able to interview them, but there was wonderful archival material on both of them, speeches they had given, the most poignant letters that they would get from players who wanted to play for them, begging to be recruited by them so they'd have a chance to make something better of their lives. And a lot of the players and some of the assistant coaches were around and were very, very accessible to me and very generous in talking at great length.
An awkward question to ask an author, but what is it that brought you to this book? Was there a certain aspect of it that was like the key to open the door for your writing it?
That's a really good question. I mean, look, the elephant in the room really is, what's a white Jewish guy from New York writing about, black college football? And one reason is that I'd written an earlier book about an African-American church and its minister, and I felt very drawn to the story of black aspiration, black self-determination, the for us, by us tradition within black life that I think doesn't get covered enough by white journalists and by white writers, but that moves me tremendously. And the minister at that church was a graduate of an HBCU of Dillard, and so hearing him talk about his experience at Dillard and listening to the way he would encourage the teenagers in his congregation to go to college at the HBCUs also got me even more attuned to it. And then I was just playing a football lover my whole life and had always wanted to write a book about football. And as I began to think about what that book might be, I thought it's got to be football and something else, football and something larger. And I thought football and race, football and civil rights, and that kind of brought me into the world of the HBCUs. The one other thing I would add is that I always felt that I was the servant of this story. This experience of these coaches, these players, this amazing world of the HBCUs didn't need me to come along and hang a ribbon on it and credential it. It was luminous and brilliant long before I ever showed up, but I felt like a sacred trust to be able to tell that story and to be able to tell it in an accurate way that the people who lived it would hopefully recognize and could read this book and say, yeah, that's the way it was.
Your inspiration for writing this book. Secondly, doing your research, what was the most surprising aspect of your research?
Great question. The most surprising aspect, well, I think at the start I knew that there would be a lot of civil rights activities at each of these schools. I hadn't realized how totally connected it was to the lives of the football teams. So that was a very pleasant surprise to have. And I think the other thing that surprised me, maybe it shouldn't have, but was to discover how, what a difficult, precarious position both these coaches were in between, and the university presidents as well, between white governments that wanted them to kind of keep a lid on everything and not make waves, and their own players and younger assistant coaches who had grown up in the era of Brown versus Board of Ed and the Civil Rights Act and had a kind of righteous impatience at the way those laws weren't being implemented, and revered and loved these coaches, but also were wanting them to do something more overtly. And it really gave me an appreciation of the difficulty of being men of that generation, and an admiration for how they were able eventually to find a way to contribute to the movement through their sport.
Yeah, Coach Gaither was a genius in his time as an offensive coach.
Yes.
Well, during his teachings, he also advocated some stuff on the defensive side. Did you cover any of that in your book?
The question is a really great one. Jake Gaither was a tremendously innovative coach. Let me first start by saying that things he did, like recruiting for speed at every position, that's the norm now in pro football and at the SEC and the top college conferences. It wasn't the norm then. Jake Gaither was one of the earliest coaches to take that idea that speed is the most important asset and conditioning. He wasn't looking for big, bulky players. He was looking for fast players and he was looking for players in incredible, cardiovascular condition. And he was a brilliant architect of offensive football. What you see now with some of these teams doing wide splits of their offensive linemen and often goes with a spread offense, Jake Gaither designed that in the 1950s. Now, he didn't do that much downfield passing, but he had the basic idea of the way you pressure a defense with wide line splits on offense. In terms of defense, I wasn't aware that he was that involved. I guess I still had some more research I should have done. He had a fantastic defensive coordinator there named Pete Griffin, who really was almost like his co-equal, was the assistant coach he trusted the most. And actually, Jake Gaither was a great person at delegating responsibility. He's really interestingly different from Eddie Robinson. Eddie Robinson was a micromanager. Eddie Robinson would have wanted to coach every single position. And if you ever saw a film of Grambling practice, as I did, you'd see Eddie Robinson going from position to position. He had great assistants, but he also really wanted to coach everything. And Jake Gaither had more of kind of the mind of a CEO, in which he oversaw everything. He certainly was deeply involved in the offense and maybe more defensively than I realized. But he had great assistants, and he wanted them to feel that they could challenge him and come to him with new ideas and not just be, as he would say, yes man. He said to one of those coaches, Bobby Lang, I don't want a yes man. I don't want a ditto man. And that was, I think, part of his genius as a coach, was making great hires for his staff and having made great hires, trusting them.
Is this gentleman back here?
Professor, I thought about this when you were saying that Eddie Robinson and Coach Gaither was criticized for being in the background during the civil rights movement. Well, during the death of Martin Luther King Jr., there was a lot of riot and unrest in Tallahassee. And a lot of the people was criticizing Coach then. But Coach told me that he has never, growing up in the South when he never had a black teacher on any level. He said that when he was in elementary school and high school and college, he went elementary school, high school, and college at Knoxville College.
Right.
And he only had, because it was illegal to teach blacks to read, he only had white missionaries from the North.
Right.
That taught him. And then he got his master at Ohio State. So he never had a black teacher. So that fact may not be known by many people.
You're right. He went to, it was a Presbyterian college, Knoxville College. I think the other thing about Jake Gaither is that when people would ask him why he wasn't angrier at white people considering segregation, and what he had endured, there's a story he told in this oral history that's just heartbreaking. When he was in his 20s and he was a high school coach, and he found out there was going to be a coaching clinic at Duke University, which at that point was all white. And he wrote a letter saying, basically, could I please be the janitor? He just wanted to be able to sweep the floors and listen in to the coaches talking and learn what he could learn. They wouldn't let him even be the janitor. But when people would ask him why he couldn't be angry at white people, one of the things he pointed to was the fact that when he was in his 30s, late 30s, he had a brain tumor. He almost died from it. He was in a coma, and a white surgeon at Vanderbilt Hospital in Nashville, a guy named Cobb Pilcher, against the segregation of Nashville at that time, took in Jake Gaither as a patient, gave him a brain operation that saved his life. And for Jake Gaither, that was always an example he cited as to why he couldn't just say that, white people are evil or, uniformly.
Question over here. Ma'am, you had a question too?
About Pete Griffin. You didn't, I saw the picture of him, but you didn't mention him.
Okay, let me correct that omission. Pete Griffin was the defensive coordinator at Florida A&M, and a really gifted coach, really Jake Gaither's right-hand man, and another very deep, sensitive guy who wrote poetry and short stories. And, one of my favorite stories about Pete Griffin has nothing to do with football. I think it says a huge amount about his character. At a time when Tallahassee wouldn't let black children swim in the municipal pool, Pete Griffin bought a vacant lot next to his house and dug a pool and installed a pool there, and he would drive his pickup truck through Tallahassee picking up black children who wanted to go swimming on the many hot days so that they could swim in his pool. And I just find that so moving, and it just says so much about him. And this is what was so great about these coaches. They wanted to win all the time, of course, but they also had such a commitment to their people, and they had such a dignified, purposeful way of life themselves.
I was curious concerning Ken Riley, who was the quarterback on the FAMU team. He never got the opportunity. He played cornerback for the Cincinnati Bengals. He was a great cornerback for the Cincinnati Bengals. And I was curious as far as if you talked to him and also Mr. Harris, how they feel about the advancements now for opportunities that are offered to black quarterbacks. If they feel it's enough, or if they feel that's still not enough.
Yeah, it's a great question about how did James Harris and Ken Riley feel about the advances of black quarterbacks. I think James Harris, they feel very different in some way because they had different experiences. James Harris knows that he didn't get all the opportunity in the pros that he deserved. He has said, and is quoted in the book, that because he felt under such pressure not to make any mistakes because he'd be pulled, that's a hard way for a quarterback to play. You have to be a bit of a gunslinger to be a successful quarterback. You can't always be cautious. So he still feels, even though he had a great record those years with the Rams, he could have been even better. He played some games under death threats, security guards on the Rams sideline to protect him. But he feels, I think, a real involvement and, real pride as to all the black quarterbacks who've gotten opportunities, really because he, again, opened that door. I think Ken Riley is certainly deeply pleased and proud to see so many black quarterbacks. And he had a great career as a defensive back, deserves to be in the NFL Hall of Fame. But he also knows he never got his chance. And I think when I watch a player today like Russell Wilson on the Seahawks, I see who Ken Riley could have been. Very similar player to Ken, similar physically, similarly wise with his field knowledge, similarly, elusive and a good improviser. And we'll never know. I mean, that's the tragedy. We will never know if Ken Riley could have been that Russell Wilson type of quarterback. And so I think there's got to be always a nagging sense for Ken of what if, even though he had an exemplary career playing a different position.
The brilliance of Coach Gaither, all of the assistant coaches were tenured professors.
Right.
They were also head coaches of other minor sports. And again, that's the brilliance of Coach Gaither.
Well, you're right. I mean, and this was true at so many of the black colleges. These coaches were erudite, learned men who, as I said, had gotten their advanced degrees at the research universities in the North. There was a guy at Tennessee State, Cat Coleman. He was the offensive coordinator there. He was a geneticist. His master's degree was from the University of Michigan. He loved to talk about molecular structure in his spare time. So whatever the stereotype is of a football coach, these guys were not the stereotype. And, their friends, Jake Gaither and his assistant coaches, were the other professors on the faculty, the ministers in town, people who were, in the Boule, which is sort of a Phi Beta Kappa kind of organization for the most accomplished black men in America. That was their peer group. They were, cream of the crop.
Yes, please give him a hand. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Freedman. A reminder for the folks watching at home on the internet, if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book and have Professor Freedman sign it for you, just call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you. We'll mail it to you wherever you are in the United States free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have Breaking the Line as well as all of Professor Freedman's previous titles for sale over there at the counter, and he is going to be signing over here at the table to the left of the screen. And please give Professor Freedman another hand. Thanks very much.